Hello and welcome to the most random YouTube channel out there. I'm finally doing the 1-year review of the Happymodel Crux35 and answering the question once and for all, is this the best 3.5-inch quad out there for you?
Oh, is that right?
I'll go into the specs a little later, but something like a 3.5-inch quad has a lot of configurations where something like a 5-inch quad really only has one mainstream configuration. But this quad comes kind of right in the middle, maybe even a little bit to the lighter side of just like a basher to kind of like throw it around a lot. It's not super heavy compared to most quads. It has pretty small motors compared to most 3.5-inch. But let me tell you, this thing is the king of its price. Coming in at $150, this thing is the king of casual drones, the king of beginner drones, and really is kind of the best bang for the buck when it comes down to it. I have abused this thing over and over and over again. Smacked it into trees, buildings, conveyor belts, the ground, asphalt, and it just refuses to die. I haven't even had to replace a prop on it, except for recently I did. I've literally had magnets falling out of the motors. I've broke the antenna off. I've cracked not the camera itself, but just the mounts and stuff. I've disconnected the wires from the camera. I had to solder those back on multiple times. So this thing takes a beating. This is by far, if you want a drone that you can smash around, this one can do it. I have heard some reports about the frames being a little bit weaker on these. I haven't really noticed that. I haven't had it break at all. When it comes down to flight time, you get about 14 minutes cruising around or 8 to 12 minutes freestyling, which is pretty insane for a quad this size and for how it flies. It's just pretty amazing. Like, my friends literally don't believe me when I tell them that, and I literally show them the DVR or a flight in front of them and they're like, they have no idea it could last that long. The 850 is a bit bigger for this quad. They recommend like a 720 or something like that, but from what I've heard on the internet, most people like to run the 850 milliamp hour, and that's the best. They're cheaper than the 720s anyways, so just go with the bigger one and it's going to be completely fine. For the motors, they use 1404 3500 kV, which is meant for like a 3-inch, but they just stretched out the frame and they put 3.5-inch props on it, which is completely fine for how this flies. But they are a little bit on the smaller size, but I wouldn't let that be a determining factor. And it does lead to better flight times. This is the analog version of the quad. They do have an HD0 version, which my friend's gonna get, and I'm excited for him because it has a really good video, and a quad this size that flies like this is pretty amazing. But the analog camera in this, it's a Caddx amp, is pretty insane for how it performs. It has a really good low light capabilities, especially for the size. And with the flight time, I was like, I take off and it's light outside, and I take my goggles off and it's dark outside, and I don't even see the difference in the camera. That's how good it is. It's obviously not the best low light camera in the world, but it is, for the size, you can't beat the Caddx amp. When it comes down to flight characteristics, this thing is really shocking for how cheap it is. It flies smooth. It kind of flies like a 5-inch, which could be a downside to most people. It's not as nimble as most 3.5-inch quads are, or 3-inch quads like what it's meant for, but it's kind of meant more as a cruisy drone. Like, it's not bad at all, but it's also tight enough that you can do some pretty insane mini courses with it. I've been honestly pretty impressed with how it flies and with the tune on it, and you could always go in and tune it up to be a little bit more snappy if you want, but honestly the stock tune on it, especially for beginners, is pretty amazing. Okay, you're not going to have the raw power of a 6S on this. You're not going to have the GoPro carrying abilities like you would have with a Cinewhoop. You're not going to have the ultra long flight times as you are with a long range. Actually, you might. I take that back. This is a pretty good long range quad too, except for you can't really go too far with its little tiny analog VTX and stuff in it, but it is pretty good. When it comes down to it, it's pretty good, and basically everything. It can do everything except for really carry a camera. You could put like a tiny camera on here if you want, but it's not really what it's meant for. It kind of does everything else like pretty solid, like not the best at anything, but it's a very casual drone to fly. This isn't like a race drone or competition drone, even though it'd be super fun to get a bunch of these and do a race with them. But this thing is very casual, very fun to fly. after a year of owning it and having drones that cost like 5 times as much, and then other drones I'm getting that are like 10 times as much, this thing is still super fun, and I still choose to fly it all the time just because it's so cheap, it's so reliable, it's very, very reliable, and it's just really a very, very, very solid quad. And this was my 6-month review of it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like to see more videos like this, like an overtime review, like 6 months, a year, or whatever, just please consider subscribing, and I'll play some crappy DVR footage of me flying this thing. Peace.